we're talking about scripture, but we need to understand that our world is more than uh, our world is more um, than, or I should say, our Christian responsibilities, our duties extend beyond Bible study and extend beyond church. And they really extend beyond to the world, because what we do in church and what we do in Bible study is preparation for what we're called to do outside of the four walls, as well as what we're called to do inside the four walls. But so I want to talk about that. I want to talk about the silent church, and we kind of talked about that, and and what I want to do is to have us all to just kind of rethink kind of like what the responsibility is of the church and of church folk, and that sort of thing. Again, we understand there's a separation between church and state, and that sort of thing, but just kind of like being thoughtful. And I thought about this, Mother Miller, I thought about this because I've been at this place many times, and on Dexter Avenue in Montgomery, Alabama. Been there many times, many times have I been at this place. And the most fascinating thing about this place, for me, Sister Betty, the most fascinating thing about this place is that church, Dexter Avenue, is a church where Martin Luther King, I believe at 26 years old, became the pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. He went to Crozier Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, which was where my wife Linda is from. In fact, she's buried right down the street from there, even right now. And so he went there to get his PhD in religious studies. I'm not really sure what it was, but he was pastor of this church. And if you look to the extreme right, left, I should say, that what you see on Dexter Avenue, the street dead ends at the state capitol. And what blows my mind about this, first of all, going into that church is historic. It's like you can, when you go in there, it's like you can hear the people as they organize the Montgomery bus boycott. You can feel it. There's a sense that you have inside of there of just people just being excited. People at a place where they said, you know what, that I don't feel no ways tired. That we've got to, we not going to continue to take this. That we're going to rise up. And there was so much organizing that took place in this church. But just a stone's throw away. I mean, it speaks to the bravery and the courage of these folks, because right down the street on Dexter Avenue is what? Is the state capitol. And on the steps of the state capitol that you see right there is where George Wallace, I mean, right down the street. How brave, how courageous, how much faith must these people have had, right? In the midst of the seat of the Confederacy. Right, I mean, right down near there is the museum. I mean, right down the street is a museum, the Civil War Museum, right? And I'm talking about I'm sorry. Let me correct that. The Confederate Museum, right? And so you can walk down. So these people are, imagine them. And if you look to the right there at the top, those people apparently are marching to the Capitol from Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And there on the state Capitol building is where George Wallace said the words, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. When he was not allowing the children to go to school at the University of Alabama, I believe it was. He didn't allow them to go, and he stood there and he blocked the entrance for days, right, until President Kennedy sent the guy from the FBI or whomever it was and blocked him. What I'm trying to get you to see here is this, is that the courage of these folks. And these folks, even with the Montgomery boycott, bus boycott, they shut things down. That these things started with the church, right? These things started with the church. And somehow, the church has kind of pulled itself back from these sorts of things. And so as a result of that, and we talked about this on last week, some of the things are slipping backwards. The Voting Rights Act and some of those things, they're slipping backwards. They have gerrymandered the borders, and borders isn't the right word, but the precincts, so that it's almost impossible in some cases for Blacks to be able to vote, and Hispanic folks to be able to vote, or a Black or a person of color to be able to be elected. that somehow we have to go back to this. You have to go back to the courage that these folks had, the courage of their conviction to say, we ain't gonna let nothing stop us. And I actually didn't want that slide in there, but it was just kind of stayed in there. But anyway, I want to go on with the lesson here. I want to talk about just determination. And you think about this, that one of the, and I'll say this a little bit later, but that one of the things that we sometimes think of in terms of pursuit, the pursuit of happiness is to get a good job, is to have get good money, and and all of those kind of things. And sometimes when we get to those places, we become complacent and we become comfortable. But the reality of the situation is this, that we must never forget where we come from. And what I mean by that is some of us might not have been born in the South. I wasn't. Some of us might not have experienced some of the things that people my age, right, experiences, and the folks that my parents, the things that they experienced and that sort of thing. But somehow we're connected. And even today, we live in comfortable houses and that, but we know even some of our church members are living in their cars and they're having struggles and that sort of thing. And so it's really important that we engage and make sure that everybody has the opportunity, right, to, as we said earlier, to have a seat at the table. So I want to talk about Queen Esther for just a minute. And it's interesting because we're talking about the silent church. And this verse says, if you keep silent at this time, Mordecai says, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish, and who knows whether or not you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this. And I remember one of the most elegant sermons that I heard about this was from Pastor Tamara. So I'm gonna try to do my best to try to talk about it a little bit. But it's interesting that I'm not going to read all of this, but in the third chapter we see that, and that things happen before us. But in the third chapter you see Haman, right? And let me go back for a minute. Who's Haman? Haman is the king's second in command, right? Queen Vashti is the first wife of King Xerxes, right? Mordecai, the uncle of Esther, who was a Jew. Again, Xerxes was the king of Persia, and Esther, queen of Persia, and also a Jew. And so Haman was this guy who was an important person in the kingdom of Persia. And he was so important that ultimately what happens is that King Xerxes, he promotes him to be the second in command over all of the provinces of Persia. And there were 127 provinces extending from India all the way to Kush, or Africa. And so he had this humongous kingdom, and he had this edict, and the edict said this, is that anyone, because he had promoted Haman, right? Anyone in any of those provinces, they had to bow down to Haman, right? And so Haman, he thought that was pretty cool. But here comes Mordecai, and Mordecai is an interesting guy because Mordecai is a Jew. And Mordecai is old enough that he was actually brought into Babylonian captivity. Now they're not in Babylonian captivity, now they're in Persian captivity, but he was brought during the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. So he'd been there for a long time, right? But Mordecai was a Jew, and Mordecai says, I'm not going to bow to this guy. And Haman is so upset. He's so upset that he says, look, he goes to the king and says, King, there's a group of people in one of your kingdoms, and they're not following your directions. And what should happen to them? And the king said, I'm gonna give you a whole lot of money, and you can wipe them all out. You can wipe all of that whole group out. And he set an edict, and he had it stamped with the king's seal that this group of people would be wiped out. And of course, he's talking about the Jews, right? So what happens is that the word comes to Mordecai that that there's a plan to kill him, but not just a plan to kill him, but to kill all of the Jews. But now it's interesting because, before this, Mordecai has a cousin, a niece by the name of Esther, and Esther's parents were deceased, and so Mordecai raised her, and now let's go back he raised her, okay, and what's interesting about that is that Xerxes' first wife, right? Can't think of her name now. We said just a minute ago, Nasty or whatever his name was. I'd say Nasty, right? That she, the king seemed like he was kind of a braggadocious kind of a guy, right? And so he had this huge party, and in this party, he allowed people to drink as much as they wanted to drink. And at some point, he wanted the queen to come out to show the queen off with the crown, and she refused to come out. Okay, and so he asked the elders what to do, and because the concern is that if he's not able to control his wife, they're thinking that the other people, right, the other men would not be able to control theirs. And so bottom line was the decision was made that she would never come before the king again. And so then after a while, the elders come together and they say, you know what, we need to, you need to get a wife. And so they set up the plan to have a beauty pageant. Long story short, Mordecai enters Esther into the beauty pageant, and she wins. And now she's the queen. She's the queen but it's interesting, obviously there were more queens. And even though she was a queen, there were certain times that you were allowed to come before the king. There were certain periods of time when you could come, and if you came at a time when you weren't invited, or the king disallowed you, you could actually be killed. Okay, so Mordecai, back to Mordecai. Mordecai he's troubled. He goes almost near the palace, right, and he he goes in a place of mourning where he has sackcloth, like and ashes and that, and he's just wailing, and it comes before the people that this is going on with him. And the word comes to Esther, and Esther says, she sends him some clothes down there, but he refuses to put on the clothes. And in fact, the people around him seeing him in mourning, and they understand his mourning, and they begin to mourn, right? And they begin to be in sackcloth and ashes and that sort of thing. And so what happens? What happens then is Mordecai sends word to Esther. Actually, Esther sends word to him. She wants to know what's going on with him. And then the word comes back, and he explains to her that Haman has constructed a situation where all the Jews would die. And so he says to her, look, you're in a comfortable position. This is the point I'm trying to get to. You're in the palace, man. You got it made. You've got servants, you've got eunuchs, you got all of this kind of stuff. But I need you to go before the king and tell the king of the plot that Haman has, right? Tell the king. And she sends back to him and says, well, I can't do that. And the reason I can't do that is because if I go before the king and the king disallows me to come, if he doesn't, allow me to come, then I can be killed. And it's interesting because we have to understand something that we're connected. And just because we find ourselves in a place of comfort, just because we've got good jobs, and just because we've got income, and just because we've got roofs over our heads and that sort of thing, doesn't mean that we don't have a responsibility to other folks. Jesus talked about loving our neighbors as ourselves. He sort of talked about having commitment one to another. Yeah, we talk about evangelism and all those things, and all of those things are absolutely important. But there are social ills that take place. And in fact, what Haman was trying to do, because he was mad at Mordecai, was try to wipe out all the Jews. Right? There are people who are constructing constructing legislation, and there are people who are gerrymandering the boundaries and that sort of thing so that you and I don't count, so that our votes don't count. Right? Thank God that there was, issues that took place, that God intervened, and things weren't worse in this election as they could have been, right? But there are things that are going on in government, and we talked about affirmative action, and we talked about things like voting rights being taken away. Those things are happening, and those are the things that because the church was so involved early on, right? Those things exist today. But those things are slowly but surely being taken away by people who want to really, demagogues who really want to control the world and control the nation and that sort of thing. And so when I think about that, I think about what kind of world is Dallas going to have, right? What kind of world are our young people going to have, or what kind of world are we going to have as we grow older and are in retirement age and that sort of thing? That somehow we've got to get involved. We can't be so comfortable. And so what does Mordecai do? He says to Esther, he says, look, like, you need to understand that God is going to deliver us. You're in a position to help, but you're concerned about yourself. You're saying, you know what, if I go, he might kill me. I might be killed. But he said, guess what? Mordecai says, guess what? He says, you know what? That if you don't do this, if you don't step up, right? God is going to find a way to deliver. But it's not going to be good for you, and it's not going to be good for your family, because God will take you and your family out. And then he says something, I think, that appeals to her. He says, maybe. And this is the thing that I think we need to think about. Maybe we are in the positions that we're in. Maybe we're on Bible study tonight. Maybe we have the jobs we have. Maybe we go to the store at certain times. Maybe God, places us in certain places at certain times, that we, we don't even think about. Maybe he sends people across our paths and we don't even see it, right? But if we're engaged and in tune and understand that we have a responsibility, right, that God will reveal to us that we have purpose, that and that it seems that God doesn't operate on coincidence, but God put her there. He put her in a position to be able to help all of our people, and so we can't allow ourselves to be so comfortable that we forget about other folks. And so what happens? Is she says, you know what, tells Mordecai, says, you know what, I'll do it. And, she uses those famous words, if I perish, I perish. The song said, if I perish, I perish. That is, I'm going to go before the king and I'm going to do what I can to intervene, right? And in the meantime, some things have happened. In the meantime, the king remembers Mordecai in the presence of Haman. The king remembers, he says, what did I, because what happened is Mordecai had overheard that there was a plot to kill King Xerxes, right? And the king somehow remembers, he said, what did we ever do? Did we ever do something good for that person, right? Right? And what's his name? And they said his name is Mordecai. Man, as soon as Haman heard that, he's scared. That's number one. He's scared, right? And so, but then Queen Esther has a party, and she invites Haman, and Haman goes and he tells everybody, I have been invited to the party. I'm going to the party, and Queen Esther has set up this party, right? And because the king had asked Queen Esther, what do you want? I'll give you half of the kingdom. What do you want? Let me have this party. Okay. And she throws this party and she invites Haman. And he leans over to the queen and he says, the king says to Esther, he said, what do you want? I'll give you half of the kingdom. And she said this, she said, I want to save me. I want to save my people and me. Because this guy has started this plan to wipe out all of the Jews, right? He has this plan to wipe out all of the Jews. And the king had signed an edict that they were going to people would be paid to wipe out the Jews, to kill them, to wipe them out. So what happens? Esther says it's Haman, right? And Haman now is scared. The king is furious. And the king walks away for a minute. And Haman goes to the queen and he leans down before the queen and says, please, queen, don't let him kill me. Don't let him kill me. And it just so happens as he's leaning towards Esther, right? Just so happens he's leaning towards Esther. The king happens to come back. And the king thinks that he's flirting with Esther now. He said, I can't believe this cat. This cat is flirting at my woman in my presence. He got to die now. And so one of the servants came and said that Haman had erected a long pole-like thing with a sharp thing on it, right? And that he had that intending to impale Mordecai on it. But the bottom line is that he was himself impaled on it. What's the point? The point is, he said, we cannot allow ourselves to be so comfortable and to be so at ease that we forget about there are other folks out there who are struggling. And God has given us the responsibility and the accountability to do what we can for them. That our responsibility is bigger than our blocks. Our responsibility is bigger than our own homes. Our responsibility is bigger than our churches, that we have to be involved. That the church has to begin to speak up like they spoke up in the 50s and like they spoke up in the 60s. But what happened is we gained a little bit of something. And we become complacent and we become comfortable, and we got to get out of that. And we got to start to raise our voices, and we got to start being busy for the Lord and doing those things that God has called us to do. Now, I went through a lot of that, and I went through that quickly because there's some other things that I want to get to tonight. And that is social accountability, right? What is social accountability? Notice Matthew 5 says this, let me tell you why you're here. You're here to be salt and seasoning that brings out God's flavors of this earth. If you lose your saltings, if you lose your purpose as a preservative, Esther's role was to preserve her people, right? Our role is to preserve and to promote our people, right? How will people taste godliness if you've lost your usefulness and you will end up as garbage? He says, here's another way to put it. You're the light, right? You're to be light. Bring out God's colors in the world. God is not a secret to be kept. We're going public with this, as public as a city on a hill. If I make you light bearers, you don't think about, you said you don't think I'm going to hide you under a bucket, do you? I'm putting you on a light stand. Now I put you there on a hilltop, on a light stand, shine. And as you view the verses above, you see the church is to be much more than a religious social club. Right. A major part of our Christian duty is to be aware of and involved in the social issues and inequities that affect our communities and in fact our world. And it's interesting because the other part of this side says, does the church have a social responsibility? It started at underlined section. It says the church's social responsibility. It has long been the conviction of the Christian social thought that the church has a social responsibility. Back in our day, our grandparents and great-grandparents' day, that responsibility was obvious. The church ran schools, it ran hospitals, it ran out of the cold programs and homeless shelters. It spoke with weight and power that had influence, right, about international and local issues. But those days in North America are long gone. And many of those churches are long gone, as Kevin Flatt writes in After Evangelism. The decline in organized religion is real, and the influence of organized religion in North America has long collapsed and is now overgrown. So what voice should the church have today in North America? And that's the question that we need to ask ourselves. Is it just to do what we've been doing, or is it to make a difference and have some impact? And notice it's interesting because when we think about that, think about those folks who gave so much for us, and those whom we stand on the shoulders of. And I was thinking about MLK. MLK went to prison. Went to jail in Birmingham, And you see them arresting him. None of this stuff that he had to do. You see them arresting him. And it was interesting too, because there's a point that I'm trying to get to right here. And the point is simply this, that there were white clergy, there were white preachers in the city of Birmingham, Alabama. There were black preachers also in the city of Birmingham, Alabama, that said, you know what, man, you're doing too much. Take it slow. You got to slow down. You got to wait. You can't get this going as if we have time, right? As if we have time to just wait for things to change. If we wait for things to change, they're not going to change. And the reality of the situation is we look even at our election, if we look even at the things that are going on in our society, right? There are things being taken away. Yeah, there's a real big issue, the issue of abortion. And Christians have varying positions on that. But you think about this, whether you think abortion is right or whether you think abortion is wrong, that there's a side of people who say we are pro-life. And yet the reality of the situation is this. And again, I'm not promoting a side one way or another. But what I'm saying is there's a subliminal message that you need to understand. That, yeah, they say, yeah, pro-life. And that they say that, if it's incest or rape or whatever it might happen to be. But there's no undergirding. What does that mean? That means that there's no money, no additional programs for adoption, no additional program for sex education and those kind of things. That when you got that baby, you just got that baby, and then what happens? Then you become part of the system. Again, I'm not arguing a point one way or the other. I'm saying though this, that it's interesting that they're saying that they're pro-life, but they're not doing anything to help people when they have children, right? They're not doing anything to help them to be successful and that sort of thing. No kind of social programs and that sort of thing. And what it does is it just continues a cycle of poverty, right? And so notice. In April of 1963, Dr. King was arrested and sent to jail for protesting segregation in Birmingham, Alabama, right? And then these 8 white ministers say, man, you're wrong. You shouldn't be doing this. That you should wait. You're moving too fast. And it's interesting because notice what he says to them. Notice what he says. He says, if we have to repent in this generation, we have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of good people. That if we don't speak up, right? If we don't speak up for the disenfranchised, if we don't speak up for those who are downtrodden, if they don't speak up for those who are in trouble, right? Who's going to speak up for them? Because the reality of the situation, most of our young people, we make up 12% of the population, but 75%. Now I know I'm exaggerating of those who are in prison. There's something wrong with that, right? And the reality is we can't be comfortable with that. And what Martin Luther King says is we can't sit idly by and be quiet. And notice what he said, and it's funny because when he talks about this, he talks about the fact that we have a mission, and our mission is from God to make a difference. It says, notice, for years now, I've heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see that that's always meant never. We must come to see that with one of our distinguished jurists, that justice too long delayed is justice denied, right? Notice, again, from his experience in jail and the attempted discouragement by white clergy, King started writing the letter from the Birmingham jail and from his jail cell. And it said he smuggled it out on toilet paper that he wrote it on. Then he polished and rewrote it in subsequent drafts, addressing it in an open letter to the 8 Birmingham clergy who told him to slow down. And he distributed that. And then he ultimately writes a book, right? And that book is titled Why We Can't Wait. And I submit to you today, the same is true, that we can't wait. That there are things that are happening, and things that are going to impact Dallas and the Johnson brothers and our young people and our young people at our church. I was thinking about Pastor Chapman's children yesterday and how involved they are, Sean's children, and the next generation of children, that we can't be silent in this thing. The church cannot be silent, right? There are some things that we have to get involved. They're changing, they're making it so that our votes don't count. They're making it so that we can't get quality education. They're gerrymandering the districts. They're doing all sorts of things, right? And we have to wake up. Right? We have to wake up. The church, if the church is not involved, it's just not going to happen. And because the church is not involved, so many of these things are going on. But our focus is in other places. Our focus is on us. And our focus is on fine furniture. Our focus is on fine edifices and all of those kind of things. But our focus should be on people. Our focus should be on understanding that things are slipping away, and we need to be paying attention to the things that are going on. Notice, it says the Negro has many pent-up resentments and latent frustrations, and they must release them. So let him march, right? The churches are not standing up to the moral responsibility. We have the moral responsibility to love our neighbors as ourselves. According to Jesus, our neighbor is anyone we're responsible for, explained Michael Slope. So who is our neighbor? Our neighbor is all of humanity. And it's our job to stand up for them. I got to get this couple of slides in if I can. And I'm talking about comfortable Christianity, but this is what I want to get to right here. I want to get to this. I remember years ago, Dr. Linda, I remember years ago that I was critical of Frederick K. Price. I was just critical because it seemed that he talked about people for being overweight. He talked about people, all kinds of stuff, right? And it was amazing to me, but I still watched it. But something happened to him, and I don't want to talk about that. In other words, we are the salt of the earth, right? We are the light of the world. And notice the headlines. It says, in 1997, Frederick K.C. Price shocked the world with a series called Race, Religion, and Racism. And I want to end with this last slide here. It says the church, and this is my title, the church must revive its social conscience at all costs. A social conscience is a sense of responsibility or concern for the problems and injustices of society. In this article titled Rude Awakening on Racism gave a minister new mission, Dr. Frederick K.C. Price demonstrates a revival in his social conscience and social consciousness. And this is an article dated July 25th, 1999, right? It says, Frederick Price, is arguably the nation's most influential African-American televangelist. But for many years, says Pastor Frederick K.C. Price of the Crenshaw Christian Center, a lot of Blacks thought I was white. Price, whose Vermont Avenue Church is the nation's biggest religious sanctuary with more than 10,000 10,000 seats, excuse or he hates or he, doesn't deal with the traditional Black church's emotionalism. He prefers opera to gospel music. He was not frequently seen feeding the poor. Notice, he was not frequently seen feeding the poor or working in the trenches of the inner cities like so many Black ministers. And the flashy faith teacher was long the darling of white evangelical prosperity preachers who proclaimed that faith in the Holy Spirit can bring concrete blessings of health, wealth, and success. And he says, I thought I didn't need to deal with Black or white, those issues. Price, a trim 67-year-old with steely eyes and blunt speech, said in an interview, I dealt with faith and I dealt with the spiritual principles of the Word of God. Then everything changed, and the man this guy, you got to understand, this guy was, he was at the top. Esther, she was at the top. And notice then everything changed. And the man who long regarded as a religious Uncle Tom is now furiously attacking racism and reaching out to African Americans with a flurry of new initiatives. The turnabout began after racism came searingly and painfully to look Fred Price straight in his eye. It came from an unlikely quarter, a sermon by the son of his longtime spiritual mentor. The traumatic event prompted Price to carry out what he calls an assignment from God, a discomforting, that's something that makes you uneasy, exhaustively detailed televised series of weekly sermons on race, religion, and racism that he has broadcast to 10 foreign countries and a national audience of 15 million. With its uncompromising tone, again, this guy had everything to lose. The series, which ends this month after 76 consecutive weeks, has toppled lifelong friendships and lost friends, right? Professional associations between Price and his wife's white evangelical associates, as well as some of his Black charismatic colleagues. That people literally walked away from him, and we'll see why in a minute. They literally walked away from him. That just because we're comfortable doesn't mean that we don't get into battle, right? That we got to get into battle. The church must be at the forefront of the battle. Notice Price himself puts the matter bluntly. I could have kept quiet, the silent church, about it. In essence, I was their house inward. He declared early in the series, I had to respond. And because I responded, they put me back in the field. It began with an audio tape in 1992. A group of Black ministers gave him a recording of a controversial sermon on race. Price recognized the voice of the pastor giving it, Kenneth Hagin Jr. Disappointed by his mentor's son, Price had long regarded the senior Hagin as the seminal influence in showing him the power of faith teaching. He had opened his home and his heart to his family and had, by his own estimates, contributed nearly $1 million to the Oklahoma-based Hagin ministry. But the younger Hagin, a nationally known minister, a man of God, a presumed believer in the one body of Christ, had been caught on tape telling his congregation that he did not believe in race mixing and that his daughter from her kindergarten years that she was told and trained not to date Blacks. Price was dumbstruck, devastated. He thought, my gosh, I've been standing next to you all these years and didn't know that you had a gun at my head. After Hagin failed to recant his remarks, apologizing only for hurt feelings, Price launched a boycott, throwing out Hagin's materials from his church bookstore, cutting off financial support, and even removing his father's name from one of the buildings. Those actions prompted half of his American ministers on the executive board and one of Price's organizations to resign in protest. People left, they walked out. Ironically, years later, before his death and after the death of George Floyd, from the pulpit, with a Black man behind him, this same Kenneth Hagin Jr. cried aloud on TV to his Black members and said, I feel your pain, right? I love you, and all of these kind of things, right? Just before he died now, he did this. He didn't do it, and notice, and he said that to his Black congregation, I'll always be there for you, with tears in his eyes. And notice a similar gentleman, Kenneth Copeland, another white minister, after George Floyd, right? He also walked away from Fred Price, made a similar plea to Black folks. See, we want your money, right? We want your money, right? But the fact of the matter is that you're not equal to us. And so we're okay with you not, don't move too fast and don't expect that you're going to be on this level. Don't expect that you're going to race mix with us and that sort of thing. Don't expect that that's going to happen, right? And so the bottom line, and we'll see on next week, you'll see statistically how important the influence of the Black church is in politics and that sort of thing. But it's important for us to understand that there's a cost associated with this. That as we step up, that there are some things that we'll see, and there's going to be some backlash to it. But we got to have going into it, we got to be like Esther. We got to know if I perish, I perish. That if I lose out, I lose out. But I'm still going to step up, and that's what Frederick K.C. Price did. That I had all kind of misgivings about him. But I'm telling you, I know I've gone long, but I had all sorts of misgivings about him. But this is the same place that we have to be. That we have to be making a difference for us making a difference for our children and for our grandchildren. Because as Mordecai says, who knows? Maybe we're here for this time. Maybe we're on the corner of 105th and Wilmington to make a difference. Maybe you're in Mickey. Maybe you're in Atlanta for a reason. Wherever you are, that you're there. God has planted you there for a reason to make a difference. And our thinking has to change. That it's more than preaching on Sunday and teaching on Monday and singing and all of those kind of things. At some point, that we got to speak the gospel with our feet. Right, going making a difference and being involved in the world of politics, being involved in social inequities and those sorts of things. That it's time for the church not to be silent, but for the church to speak up. It's time for that to happen now. Because if we don't, just look around. Just look around. If we don't, and let me tell you something. Even with that small that small edge of maybe 2 or 3 Congress people in Congress, a lot of things are going to change, because a lot of those Congress people who are on those impactful committees are going to be pulled off of those committees. McCarthy's already talking about it. He's already pinpointed them. Things are going to change. And the reality of the situation is we as a church need to be aware of it, and we need to get involved. We are salt, we are light, we are influencers, we are impactors. And God is calling on us to make a difference. It is our social responsibility, but it's also our religious responsibility. We're called to this work. We're called to be light. We're called to be salt. We're called to make a difference. God bless you. I went over, but just thank you all for your time. God bless you tonight. Amen.